Works all the time. Good afternoon. I'm Fred Leon, Professor of Psychology and Director of the Consortium for Multicultural Psychology Research. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the 2018 Annual Distinguished Lecture on Multicultural Psychology. We're very pleased to have Dr. Robert McCrae, who's retired from the National Institute of Aging, give this year's lecture. But before I introduce Jeff, I'd like to take care of a couple items. First, to remind everyone that we'll be having a reception with light refreshments and drinks at the end of the presentation at 5 upstairs in room 230. Everyone is invited, and I hope that many of you can stay for the reception, which is to honor our invited speaker and also the winner of the 2018 Joseph L. White Award. Next, I'm pleased to continue our tradition of presenting the Joseph L. White Outstanding Student Multicultural Research Award at the beginning of this annual distinguished lecture. To present this year's award, I'd like to introduce Professor Lee Jun from the CMPR Awards Committee.
Yeah, I have the honor of just presenting the award, and I was also asked to say just a few words about Joe White. First, the committee consisted of Bill Chopic, I think I saw him here, and Ignacio Aceveda. The three of us were the committee members. And the award is named after Dr. Joseph L. White. And for those of you who've been around for a while, we know that he regularly visited Michigan State University. He was the first African American to receive a doctorate degree from the clinical program, probably from the psychology department, period, but from the clinical program. And he received that degree in 1961. Some other sources say 62, so we're saying the early 60s. Just a brief history of PhDs. The first American doctorate was given in 1886. The first African American to receive a doctorate was given in 1920. And so 34 years after the first doctorate for anybody, an African American received one. Then Michigan State University came along 75 years later, and awarded the first PhD to an African American. Joe White, if you know him, was a very gregarious person, a very bubbly personality, and his signature contribution, in my opinion, to the field was that in the late 60s, there were a group of individuals. He was at San Francisco State, who had been freshly awarded PhDs, African Americans, and began to raise some questions about the field of psychology and how blacks were being represented or being looked at within the field. And so he and some other individuals got together and they formed in 1968 the Association of Black Psychologists. And what really put Dr. White on the radar screen is he wrote an article and he decided not to publish it in one of the mainstream journals, and he published it in Ebony magazine in 1970, and it was called Toward a Black Psychology. And so those of you who know the history of Ebony, at that time it probably had a circulation of several million, and most people within the African American community would read it. And so they went ahead and began to develop what's now the whole field of multicultural psychology. He went on and worked at the University of California at Irvine, and then unfortunately in November of 2017, as he was flying from California to visit his daughter, he had a heart attack. And they had a very nice memorial service in Irvine in December. I had the privilege of attending, and he was very well received. And I will say to the Michigan State individuals that one of the things that Joe White was extremely pleased with was his association with Michigan State University. And he carried the Spartan banner wherever he went, even though he did not have any tenure as an academic person here other than being awarded the degree. So he's very well deserving of the consortium changing the name and honoring him in this regard. And so with that, I have now the pleasure of introducing the 2018 recipient of the award, and that is in the person of Samantha Shires. I'm going to ask her to come up, and come on up, Samantha. Let's give her a round of applause. Not wanting to take too much time, I gave her a very brief chance, 60 seconds or less, to just tell you the title of her research and any other brief comments you would like to make.
So my name is Samantha, and I'm a third-year student in the clinical psychology program. The title of my project was Discrimination and Ethnic Racial Socialization Among Youth Adopted from South Korea into White American Families, and I especially wanted to thank my advisor, Alex Burt, as well as my other committee members, Nicole Buchanan and Ignacio Acevedo, for their help and guidance on this project. So thank you very much.
And she gets a certificate, and a $500 monitor award will be coming to you from the graduate school. Let's give her another round of applause.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Congratulations again, Samantha, and my thanks to the awards committee. Now back to our main event. It's my pleasure to introduce our invited speaker. Robert McCrae was a personality psychologist at the National Institute of Aging in the intramural research program. He spent his career studying the stability of personality across age and culture. He's co-author with Paul Costa Jr. of the Neo Inventories and the book entitled Personality in Adulthood, a five-factor theory perspective. In the 1990s, he began a series of collaborations in over 50 nations that focused initially on the generalizability of trait structure across cultures, and subsequently encompassed analysis of the universality of age and gender differences, scaled reliability, and trait heritability. His five-factor theory offers one way to reconcile the demonstrated universal traits of psychology with the indisputable variations in thinking, feeling, and behavior that are seen across the cultures. And though he's retired some 9 years ago, I believe, he's still very active, having just completed an annual review of psychology chapter. What is less well known about Jeff is that he's a Spartan, having completed his undergraduate degree here at MSU some 50 years ago. So the title of his presentation is Universals in Personality Trait Psychology. So please join me in giving a warm welcome home to Dr. McCrae.
Thank you. Although I majored in philosophy here at MSU a half a century ago, my favorite courses were from other departments. One was a year-long survey of Russian literature and translation that was taught by Frank Ingram. And the other was an anthropology course called Culture and Personality. It was taught by John Useem. And there we covered Ruth Benedict and Ralph Linton and Clyde Kluckhohn, and were introduced to such ideas as basic personality structure and national character and modal personality. And all of these grand ideas were illustrated in the context of the exotic cultures that anthropologists used to study. In the interest of full disclosure, I should say that I only got a 3.0 in that course. In view of my later work in the field, some of you will think that is ironic, and others may think it prophetic. In any case, the basic message of most versions of Culture and Personality seemed to be that human nature was the product of particular cultural systems, which imparted personality to their members in much the same way that they imprinted language. To the activists of the 60s, that implied that if we could fix culture, we could produce generations of creative, loving, and happy people. I spent one summer writing a grandiose treatise on what I call cultural therapy, intended to do just that. But the 60s ended, and I went on to study personality. And by the time I returned to these issues in the 1990s, things had changed. Culture and personality had largely disappeared from anthropology, and I had developed quite different ideas about human nature. My subsequent cross-cultural research provided some of the strongest evidence for my new ideas. Before I get to my results and my interpretation of them, I want to say something about research methods in cross-cultural psychology. It seems to me there have been three phases. The earliest cases were modeled on anthropological fieldwork. A Western psychologist might journey to a foreign culture, collect data, and compare it to the similar data from back home. The most famous of these studies, I suppose, is Paul Ekman's study on facial expressions of emotion, which was conducted among the isolated Foray people of New Guinea. Well, this is, of course, a rather one-sided approach that assumes that the methods and the concepts used are meaningful in some new culture, and that a psychologist from outside the culture can properly interpret the results. Clearly, there are benefits to collaborating with indigenous psychologists who can provide a different perspective, and I suspect most cross-cultural studies published in the last 40 years have followed this model. In the beginning, that strategy was somewhat limiting because the only trained psychologists came from westernized nations. But by now, there are psychologists in virtually all countries, and many of them are very eager to collaborate in research. And that is, in fact, how I conducted all of my research. In the beginning, I was contacted by psychologists who wished to translate and use our instrument, the neo-inventories. I worked with them in the translation process, and they shared the data that they gathered. Later, when we designed large multinational studies, we identified local personality psychologists and invited them to join us as translators, data collectors, and co-authors. Here, for instance, are my collaborators on one project. We also tried to engage our respondents in their own culture. In particular, although some participants completed the questionnaires in English or another second language, French or Spanish, for example, about 85% of them completed them in their own language. Now, I cannot pretend that this was a completely collaborative project. We designed the study, we supplied the instruments, we analyzed the data, we drafted the manuscripts. But our colleagues abroad examined and sometimes modified the translations, selected the samples, administered the instruments, and gave us feedback on the process. And of course, all co-authors were given a chance to comment on manuscripts before submissions and revisions, and a number of their corrections and suggestions were in fact incorporated into the final versions. I have perhaps belabored this point because the current phase of research using internet data is in some senses a step backwards. A recent study by a colleague and co-author of mine, Multicultural and her colleagues, used personality data from 62 cultures. Participants were self-selected to fill out a personality questionnaire, this is on the internet, and to receive feedback. They could only choose German, English, Spanish, or Dutch versions of the questionnaire, and all of the authors appear to be either Dutch or American. In fact, there aren't even any acknowledgments of cultural consultants in the manuscript. I do not mean to suggest that research conducted without the input of a local psychologist is necessarily flawed. In fact, I believe Ekman's conclusions about the universality of facial expressions is essentially correct, and I have every reason to think that the concepts and measures that Blydorn and colleagues used are appropriate around the world. But I personally feel more comfortable knowing that my cross-cultural research has been reviewed by people with first-hand knowledge of each of the cultures involved. And I hope that the sheer convenience of conducting internet studies does not lead to an abandonment of the collaborative approach. I think it's fair to assert that the most exciting development in personality psychology in the 1980s was the rise of the five-factor model. The appeal of the model was that it was comprehensive, encompassing almost all of the traits assessed by personality inventories. Few of the existing measures, however, covered all five factors in detail, so Paul Costa and I developed a series of instruments, the neo-inventories, to measure the FFM, with 6 traits or facets in each of the 5 domains. This says, you'll notice, neo-inventories version. There are lots of five-factor models and many, many measures of them. This is the one that I'm going to talk mostly about. Beginning in the early 1990s, we began to get requests to translate the neo-inventories from researchers who hoped to use them in their own cultures. We were cautiously encouraging. At the time, we knew very little about personality across cultures. Would the constructs that you see here be meaningful at all in, say, collectivistic cultures or non-Indo-European languages? Could one assess them by simply translating our items, if you can translate them at all? Or would researchers in different cultures have to create their own emic scales, as Fanny Chung did? Well, the only way to find out was to make the translations, collect the data, and take a look. But how would you know if the data made sense? Normally, a whole program of research on convergent and discriminant validity is required to validate scales. But here, there was a shortcut possible. The 6 facets in each domain ought to be positively intercorrelated. That's evidence of convergent validity. And they ought to be independent of all the rest of the scales, which is discriminant validity. In other words, they ought to define 5 distinct factors. Now, in principle, it could have turned out that the individual facets were actually valid measures, but that their structure was different in different cultures. There could be just 2 factors, or there could be 10 factors. But the simplest hypothesis was that the whole FFM structure would be replicated, so that comparing the factor structure of the translation with the American structure would tell us at a glance how similar these personality structures were. The earliest colleagues to send us data provided actually large samples from Germany, Portugal, Israel, Hong Kong, South Korea, and Japan. Fortunately, these cultures represented a very diverse set of languages coming from different language families. As you know, families of languages descended from a common ancestor. Proto-Indo-European is thought to be the origin of languages as different as Persian and Icelandic. Languages in a family share some cognate vocabulary and some features of grammar and syntax that distinguish them from other families. If you subscribe to the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis that language shapes thought, you might argue that languages from the same family would think alike, and those from different families would have vastly different ways of thinking about the world and about themselves. This diversity in languages was also important because the FFM had originally been discovered in analyses of English language trait terms. And some psychologists assumed that it was in fact probably a reflection of the English language and its structure. Maybe a closely related language like German would have a similar structure, but there was really no reason to hope that distant languages like Korean would show anything like the FFM. But they did. Here are two-factor analyses that we published in American Psychologist in 1997. These are the two largest samples we had to happen to have. They're both well over 1,000. The factors, these are actually Verimax rotated principal components, have been reordered and they're arranged side by side. So you have the Korean and Portuguese neuroticism factor and then the Korean and Portuguese extroversion factor, and so on. If you look down the diagonal, what you will see is that each factor is defined chiefly by the intended facets, just as it is in English. Now, some of the matches were not perfect. For example, assertiveness and activity don't define the extroversion factor in Portuguese. But that turns out to be a quirk of factor rotation. By the time we had written this paper, we had developed a form of confirmatory factor analysis using targeted rotation that provided what we think was a better assessment of the actual similarity of factor agreement. And using this technique, we concluded that when rotation was guided by a hypothesized target, virtually identical structures were found in all seven samples, with factor congruence coefficients between each pair of cultures, including American, all above 0.89 and most above 0.95. We described these results as evidence for personality structure as a human universal. Technically, of course, one cannot prove that something is universal without replicating it in each and every existing culture. And no one has done that, and no one ever will. Our argument is that universality is the most parsimonious explanation for the remarkable agreement seen between these seven very distinctive cultures with very divergent languages. That hypothesis has held up well. Here are some other language families in which we have subsequently replicated the structure. Although the replication was pretty marginal in the case of Zimbabwe, due in part, we think, to problems with the translation into Shona. And those translational problems were due in part to the political instability of Zimbabwe at the time the research was conducted. It was a quick and dirty study, and the results were a bit dirty as a result. Some of you will recall a study by anthropologists that seems to falsify the claim of universality. Gervin and colleagues administered a version of the Big Five inventory to a group of non-literate inhabitants of the Bolivian Amazon, the Tsimane. And they reported poor psychometric properties, at best suggesting something like extroversion, agreeableness, and conscientiousness factors. And they concluded that the FFM really isn't truly universal. Well, I have great admiration for this work and the amount of effort that goes into dealing with a large sample of pre-literate research participants. But I'm not absolutely convinced by their conclusions. An alternative view is that groups such as this simply do not comprehend the task of making abstract personality ratings. Suppose instead 100 anthropologists had been assigned to live among the Tsimane for 6 months and to become well acquainted with them as individuals. If we then asked the anthropologists to rate these individuals on the Big Five inventory, or better yet, the Neo-PI3, we might find that the FFM was replicated in this population too. But we don't know. Certainly it is possible that there are groups whose personality traits are not accurately described by the FFM. but I believe enough studies have now been conducted in enough cultures to justify the claim that, for all practical purposes, it is universal. Let me explain. The data sets we analyzed in our American Psychologist article had two limitations. First, because they were provided by other researchers, they differed widely in their size and sample composition, and so they weren't easily compared. And second, they all used self-reports of personality. Perhaps all that we had shown was that people everywhere described themselves in the same ways. To address these issues, Antonio Terracciano and I initiated the Personality Profiles of Culture project, or what I call the PPOC. We asked colleagues around the world to recruit about 200 participants. And these participants were asked to think of an individual they knew well and to provide ratings on the observer rating form of the NEO-PI. We specified for each participant the age and the sex of the target, so we had a variation by gender and by adult age group. These data, as you can imagine, have been used in quite a number of publications, but I'll chiefly be concerned with the first of them on universal features of traits. So the first question is the structure of personality the same when assessed by observers? Yes, it is. This slide shows the factor structure of the combined data, standardized within cultures, by the way, although it didn't make any difference. What you see here is the 5 factors. Again, there are the 30 facets are the variables that are being factored, and they are clustered by the theoretical domain or factor to which they belong, so that the defining items ought to be along the diagonal, and as you can see, they mostly are. The factor congruence coefficients in the last row of the table show that the pan-cultural structure of informant-rated personality is virtually identical to the structure of American self-reports. There were, I think, 27 different languages used and 50 cultures. What this means to me is that the scales of the NEO inventories and the constructs that they assess are valid and meaningful in a very wide range of cultures. Now, in itself, that doesn't mean that they have what is called scalar equivalence, so that you could compare directly the values across cultures. But it does, and I should say that that's a controversial issue, and I'm not going to get into it today. We'll take that up another time. But these kind of data do justify the examination of many properties of traits within each culture. And that's what I'm going to be doing mostly today. Consider sex differences. In 2001, Costa, Terracciano, and McCrae looked at gender differences in 26 cultures using self-report data generously provided by our colleagues. This is a kind of peculiar slide. It shows the differences associated with each of the 30 NEO facets represented by blue diamonds. The vertical axis is American data, and the horizontal axis reports the mean of the 26 other cultures. Most of these differences are small. You'll notice the metric, the extent of the thing is half a standard deviation. But the pattern between American and international differences is very similar. The correlation is 89. And you can see from the facets that have labels attached that women everywhere tend to score higher than men on anxiety, vulnerability, and openness to aesthetics, whereas men, on average, score higher than women on excitement-seeking, assertiveness, and openness to ideas. If these differences sound stereotypical, well, they are. A later study of gender stereotypes confirmed that people all around the world believe that these differences characterize typical men and typical women. But this, remember, is self-report data. This is how women describe themselves and how men describe themselves. What if you look at observers? Sometimes men describing men, sometimes men describing women. What do you see then? Well, we have the PPOC to answer that. And here's a very busy slide. The 4 columns of data here represent Cohen's D-score differences between men and women for each of the 30 facets. For instance, the first row shows that women are perceived as, on average, about 1/3 to 1/2 standard deviation higher than men in anxiety. The first 2 columns are taken from that 2001 self-report study, although they're subdivided here into college-aged and adult subgroups. The last 2 columns are from PPOC, that is to say they're observer rating data. And what you'll notice is the columns are very similar. The correlations between these columns ranged from 72 to 88. So it appears that age differences are much the same, well, or you could say sex differences are much the same in different ages and in different methods of measurement pretty much everywhere. What about age differences? Well, we conducted a series of comparisons of age differences in different cultures, again using self-report data from colleagues. And here's a summary of what we found. Neuroticism, extroversion, and openness declined with age in most cultures. This is a compilation of 12 cultures. Agreeableness and conscientiousness increased significantly in all the cultures that we examined. A unanimous agreement there. And here are the data from PPOC. It's an even busier slide. Well, you can't read the numbers, but you can notice that there are patterns of minus signs in some of the columns, and that there are asterisks, lots of them, in some of the columns. There are, in fact, 2 striking findings here. The first is that the cross-sectional declines in extroversion and openness, and the increase in conscientiousness that we had seen in self-report data are replicated in almost all cultures. 143 of the 150 age differences, 95%, are in the hypothesized direction, and 74% of them are statistically significant. There's no crisis of replicability here. But equally striking are the weak findings for neuroticism in the first column and agreeableness in the fourth column. Only 7 correlations are significant for neuroticism, and 2 of these are in the wrong direction. Only 12 are significant for agreeableness, and again, 2 of them are in the wrong direction. Quite frankly, I have no idea why this happens. And I consider it one of the profoundest mysteries of the study of aging and personality. But whatever the cause of the discrepancies between self-reports and observer ratings on age differences in these 2 traits, it seems to be universal. Let me now turn to some psychometric properties. Each of the 30 neo-facets is assessed by an 8-item scale. And for each, you can calculate a number of properties, such as internal consistency or retest reliability or heritability. And of course, these vary somewhat across scales, and they also vary across cultures. However, in the course of writing a paper on reliability, I noticed that the ranking of facets was very similar across cultures. Some may have more reliable data than others, but the rank order of the facets remains relatively constant. Let me show you what I mean. These are heritability estimates for 4 studies from 4 different cultures. And in absolute terms, you'll notice the most striking finding here probably is the much lower values in the 4th column, Sardinia, than in the other 3 columns. However, I have to say that this is not a cultural effect. The explanation for it is that the first 3 studies are twin studies using MZ and DZ twins, whereas the Sardinia data are from family studies using other kinds of relatives. And it is well known that the heritability estimates you get from family studies are much lower than those that you get from twin studies. Although I don't think anyone understands why that's true. You'll notice that these facets are not listed in the usual order. Instead, they are listed in increasing mean size. And that makes it easier, I think, to see what I'm calling differential heritability, the heritability of each facet relative to the other facets. And you can see how it's similar across cultures. For example, deliberation and altruism at the top are among the least heritable traits in each culture. Gregariousness and openness to ideas and aesthetics are among the most heritable in all 4 cultures. And again, the correlation between columns of these heritabilities ranged from 34 to 71. The same differential ranking of neo-facets holds for internal consistency and for retest reliability. There's consensual validation in all cultures that we've looked at it. That is to say, observers do agree with self-reports if the observers are well acquainted with the targets they're rating. But further, the amount of cross-observer agreement varies between facets, and that differential agreement is consistent across cultures. Alec and colleagues used PPOC data to show that self-reports differ from observer ratings in their mean levels. For example, people describe themselves as somewhat less conscientious than observers describe these same people. And there are these kinds of fairly subtle differences for many traits in the entire personality profile. Those profiles of differences between self-reports and ratings was similar, highly similar in 28 of 29 cultures that they looked at. Denmark, for some reason, showed a deviant pattern that nobody has been able to explain. Chan and colleagues showed that when people are asked to describe traits of the typical young, middle-aged, and old adult, the same age stereotypes are found across a wide range of cultures. And Lerkenhoff and colleagues did the same for stereotypes about sex differences. And incidentally, when you average these stereotypes across a large group of raters, the consensual age and sex stereotypes are actually fairly accurate compared to objective data. Finally, Yamagata and colleagues looked at the genetic correlations among neo-facets in samples of Canadian, Japanese, and German twins that I showed you earlier. When you factor these genetic correlations, lo and behold, there's the familiar FFM in all 3 of these cultures. And that, I believe, is the key to understanding the universality of traits. Traits have the same structure, the same age differences, the same differential reliability across a wide range of cultures because traits are not shaped by culture. They are a product of the human genome. Because Homo sapiens is a single species, trait psychology transcends culture. But if this is so, why didn't we understand it a long time ago? How were anthropologists fooled into thinking that people in different cultures had dramatically different personalities? Well, surely it is because people behaved differently. They had different values and beliefs and roles and routines, and these were closely tied to their cultural environments. And so I think the moral is that we cannot understand personality and culture without making a fundamental distinction between personality traits themselves and their expression in culturally contextualized values, beliefs, roles, and so on. As Leon expressed it, human beings are dynamic, multidimensional beings who function on multiple levels. Trying to understand human beings by attending to only one level will often lead to an incomplete understanding and frequently to misunderstanding and miscommunication. Well, there are several ways in which one might conceptualize these different levels. You might talk about biological versus cultural, or universal versus individual. I have a slightly more elaborate set of concepts to distinguish these levels in something that Paul Costa and I call five-factor theory, or FFT. And I'll give you a very simplified summary of that theory. It looks like this. In the figure, the personality system has two central components. Personality traits, which are actually part of a broader class of basic tendencies, and characteristic adaptations. Well, by traits, I mean the psychological tendencies that are measured by the neo-inventories and other scales. The five broad factors and their facets. Characteristic adaptations are a vast array of acquired personality features that differ among individuals. Here are some examples. It includes social skills, vocational interests, daily routines, relationships, identity. Note that these are topics of interest to almost all psychologists, including developmentalists and social psychologists and cognitive psychologists who may have no interest whatsoever in personality traits. But for the personality psychologist, most of these would be considered personality correlates. The black arrows in this diagram represent causal pathways that are recognized in the theory. Over time, characteristic adaptations are formed that are influenced both by the individual's constellation of traits, that's why we call them characteristic, and by environmental influences of culture and family and job and so on, to which the individual must adapt. Behavior, it is these characteristic adaptations that interact directly with the demands and opportunities of the situation to produce specific behaviors. So traits don't have a direct, but only an indirect effect on behavior. And FFT claims that traits are shaped by biology. And that includes genes, but it also includes other biological things such as drugs, and diet, and aging, and disease. And that view of a biological basis to traits is consistent with a long tradition of research on temperaments. That's not a very radical idea in itself. What is a very radical idea is what arrow is missing. There is no effect of the environment on traits themselves. That is a radical idea. It is foreign to the thinking of most psychologists, and it's not popular, I can tell you that. It's also an oversimplification. There are certainly exceptions to this generalization. But as a general principle, it explains a host of well-documented facts that are, I think, otherwise quite baffling. Why are individual differences stable across decades despite the changing roles of adult life? Why does growing up in the same family have no effect on the resemblance of twins? Why do the events of history leave so little mark on successive generations that age differences in traits are similar in all nations, regardless of their history? Why do chimpanzees have traits similar to humans and similar developmental courses for those traits? And why despite the systematic, pervasive, and persistent influences of vastly different cultures, is the structure of personality traits universal? Well, the simplest answer is that traits are shaped by biology and not by experience. If my data are correct and my interpretations are reasonable, what does it mean for multicultural psychology? The first conclusion is that standard measures of personality traits can legitimately be used and exported to almost any culture, and can be used there as a component of psychological research. And that fact transforms personality psychology into an international enterprise. Let me give you an example. Recently, I wrote a paper dealing with the psychometrics of method biases in self-reports and observer ratings. And it made a series of predictions about the magnitude and the structure of these method biases. And naturally, I wanted to test those predictions. What I needed was a data set with both self-reports and observer ratings on a large sample of individuals. Unfortunately, I am retired. I don't have any large data sets or any small data sets. But I do have colleagues, and they had such data. Actually, there were 2 such samples. And I'm happy to report that we conducted the analyses, and they seem to provide strong support for my hypotheses. That paper's under review, so we'll have to find out if that is true or not. But the fact that the data are from Estonia and the Czech Republic is quite incidental. All trait data are more or less interchangeable. It's this universality of traits that makes internet research legitimate, although not, in my view, ideal. The use of the same standard assessment instruments in different cultures is sometimes described as an etic approach, contrasting with an emic approach in which culture-specific characteristics are assessed. These two are not mutually exclusive, and a recent American psychologist article proposed a combined etic-emic approach to personality as a way of combining the methodological rigor of the etic approach and the cultural sensitivity of the emic approach. And this seems to me like a commendable idea, but it takes on a particular interpretation from the perspective of 5-factor theory. There, personality traits are seen as manifestations of universal human nature, so they are all etic. One can create an emic measure of an etic trait. I suppose that any translation into a different language is a sort of emic adaptation, but the trait itself is etic. But recall that personality is more than just traits. And an emic approach makes perfect sense in dealing with characteristic adaptations. And you recall what those were. These are the variables that can and usually should be assessed with emic measures. A good deal of pure and applied personality research is concerned with determining the personality trait predictors of values, interests, relationship styles, ways of coping, and so on. For both scientific and practical purposes, it would make sense to study the values, interests, relationship styles, and ways of coping that are relevant in a particular culture. A vocational interest inventory that asks if respondents would like to be a sea captain or a forest ranger would be of little value in Burkina Faso, a landlocked Saharan nation. Etic traits should predict emic characteristic adaptations. Finally, I want to raise one more issue. Multiculturalism recognizes and even celebrates diversity, and the idea that trait psychology is universal may be somewhat hard to swallow. But let me remind you that traits themselves point to another kind of diversity, individual differences between people within each culture. We might call this intracultural diversity, and I think it too deserves to be recognized and celebrated. Let me disabuse you of one notion. There's a belief among some cultural psychologists that traits are really only relevant to people in individualistic cultures. In collectivistic cultures, they claim, behavior is shaped by the social situation and the relationships among the participants, not by the personal dispositions of the individuals. So even if traits can be measured everywhere, they have little functional significance in many cultures. Well, Tim Church and his colleagues have conducted a painstaking series of studies to address this issue, chiefly using American, East Asian, and Latin American cultures. And here's their conclusion. We noted good support for trait perspectives on cross-situational consistency, cross-observer agreement, and trait validity across cultures, and at best, mixed support for cultural psychology perspectives on traits. I think this means that multicultural psychologists need to examine their cultural variables in conjunction with trait differences. For one thing, this could eliminate possible confounds. One of the most consistent findings with regard to the mean national levels of traits is that collectivistic cultures tend to have more introverted members. Here's a color-coded map for you, where red, brighter red refers to higher extroversion scores. And the bright red extroverted nations are mostly from the individualistic cultures of Europe. Now, what about observer rating data? These are self-report data. But in observer rating data from the PPOC, the culture level correlation of extroversion and Hofstede's individualism scale was 51. Hofstede and I once had a friendly debate about which of these was the cause and which was the effect. It's one of my favorite papers because it has two discussion sections, Hofstede's discussion and McCrae's discussion. But in either case, personality becomes a potential rival hypothesis in studies on the effects of collectivism. For example, Matsumoto and colleagues compared emotional experiences in Americans and Japanese and found that Americans reported longer and more intense feelings and were more likely to express them than the Japanese. Well, I would expect that would be true if you compared a group of extroverts and a group of introverts. At a minimum, in such a study, one ought to assess extroversion for use as a covariate. But there are also more interesting possibilities that I think we've really not begun to explore. Nisbet and colleagues, for example, have conducted a number of studies on holistic versus analytic styles of thought and perception. Openness to experience is a personality dimension that is also concerned with thought and perception. Open people score higher in measures of divergent thinking, and they appear to be more sensitive to their environments. Suppose Nisbet had used a 2x2 design comparing Asians and Americans who were open versus closed. Would these two dimensions have independent effects, or would they somehow interact? Perhaps Asians and Americans who are high in openness, and thus more cognitively flexible, would use both holistic and analytic modes, whereas their closed compatriots would specialize in the one approach that was favored by their culture. The great age of culture and personality studies was marked by bold and creative thinking, but its practitioners lacked an empirically supported theory of personality and tools for personality assessment. Armed as we now are with the conceptual distinction between traits and characteristic adaptations, and with validated measures of the comprehensive five-factor model of personality traits, we should be able to reinvigorate the field. Our new studies of culture and personality will show how universal traits and ubiquitous individual differences operate in different cultural contexts to produce the full spectrum of human thought, feelings, and actions. Thank you.
My question is about the aspect of your model that suggests that the environment has relatively little impact upon traits. Is it plausible that that's true in the normal range of environments, but that when one goes to extreme instances of environmental variation, that it breaks down? So, for example, with prolonged neglect or abuse over a long period of time, that even these biologically determined predispositions can be altered or in some profound way.
That is certainly possible. That's why I said this is a generalization. And so what you're suggesting is that it's a generalization that holds in the average expectable environment, but not necessarily in extremes. The data on tying traumatic events to subsequent changes in personality are not as compelling to me as they are to other people, but there certainly are such data, and that's certainly an area in which that would be a plausible place to look for exceptions to that generalization.
I appreciate the lecture, but I'm asking in the context, this is the Joseph White, whatever.
Okay.
And in 3 months, we're going to be meeting in California celebrating 50 years of Association of Black Psychologists. And then I watched your slides, and then you mentioned Zimbabwe. And then later, the other one, I think the sex differences, you had 3 African countries, Uganda, Nigeria, and Ethiopia. I'm just kind of curious. One of the reasons, that was formed was that traditional psychology kind of didn't thoroughly explore those kind of dimensions. So 2 questions. What would have to happen in order to make sure, even on the cover slides, only so 3 colors, to make sure that there's more representation from those countries? And how comfortable are you really in making the conclusions you are, given the scarcity of data, particularly from the African countries?
Well, I'm more confident than these data would support because there are other data. In particular, a colleague, Jérôme Rossier from Switzerland, has conducted studies in French-speaking African nations, of which there are a number, and he has something like 10 or 12 African nations, and comes up with very similar kinds of results. We had, I think it is about, well, we have Uganda, Zimbabwe, South Africa, and at least one other black African nation in our sample. And as I say, there are other languages. But I would, of course, be delighted to have more participation from, we have Nigeria, from black African psychologists in these kinds of studies. And I think we will get more. I think it's just a matter of time, and also the effort, as people like Jérôme have made, to pursue that.
So the short answer is there's more data than you.
That's the short answer.
All right.
How do you measure culture? It sounds like you're really just looking at nations or national. So there's great diversity within each nation, and so I don't know what American means here. We have matriarchal societies like the indigenous populations here that are included in there, and so on.
A couple. In general, your point is absolutely correct. There are subcultures within cultures that we obscure when we do many of these analyses. But it's also the case that we've made some distinctions. For example, we have a distinction between French-speaking Switzerland and German-speaking Switzerland. We've looked at both of those. We have also, and between Irish and English parts of the UK. We also have had instances of samples. For instance, our American data is basically from a half a dozen different college sites around the country, and they all look very similar. They're all college students, and that's a different issue of generalization, but regional differences don't seem to pop up in these analyses. At least not large enough to change the basic conclusions. There are some interesting cases in which we have, for instance, in the Philippines, we have one sample that completed the English language version of the test and one that completed the Filipino translation. And if you plot their profiles, they're almost identical. We have instances in India where we have the Marathi translation and Telugu translation, and that's an interesting comparison because Telugu is a Dravidian language instead of an Indo-European language. And again, if you plot their profiles, they look very similar. So when we have been able to look at subcultures within a nation, they tend to look more similar than they do to other nations outside.
What about matriarchal cultures?
Such as?
I think they have some indigenous populations here.
Yeah. We have not been able to look at indigenous populations, the kind of, like the Bolivian samples. I would love to do more research like that, but I depend on having a psychologist from the culture administer the tests and so on. And obviously we're not going to find that in very many indigenous cultures.
And how do you have biomarkers that you're using? How do we get, so you find some universal commonality. How do we get from those commonalities to biology?
Oh goodness, I'm not the person to ask because I'm not a biological psychologist. And frankly, I have avoided most of the speculation about that because what limited knowledge I have is that we are just beginning to understand neuroscience, and it would be premature to try to make... It's one thing to say there's a genetic basis for a trait because we can see it in twins. It's another to say it's this gene and that gene and the other. As you know, that's been an extremely difficult thing to do. And so that's one of the challenges and opportunities for future researchers.
Thank you.
So you focus on the NEOPI for obvious reasons. How do you feel about, one of the criticisms of the NEOPI is the length of the questionnaire. How do you feel about relatively short versions like Gosling's TIPI or the BFI measure, the 45 items? And how well do you think that those capture the underlying characteristics of personality that you guys are assessing in the NEOPI or NEOPI 3?
I think the answer is that it depends on the level of accuracy you're interested in. If you just want to say neurotic people are more likely to have depression than non-neurotic people, then almost anything that you use is going to do that. If you want to distinguish between bipolar depressives and unipolar depressives, I would want more fine-grained instruments, and fine-grained instruments have to have more items. There's another problem with the very short, the 2-item, 1-item inventories, and that has to do with specific variance in items. According to the analyses that I've done, a typical item in a personality scale has about 12% of its variance measuring what the scale is supposed to measure. So if you have an anxiety item, about 12% of the variance of that item is true anxiety. About 30%, no, 24% is something that's very specific to that particular item that is not what anxiety is. It's something about this particular thing. So that when an item says, I'm afraid of heights, it's not the afraid of, it's the heights that determines the response. Well, if you've got 2 items in a scale, that's mostly specific variance. It's not mostly anxiety, even though both of them may be perfectly good anxiety items. You don't have enough of them, and you have enough systematic, persistent variance. It's not that there's not measuring something, it's just not what you think it is. So I have a lot of problems with very short items. There are occasions in which you'll want to use medium length. The BFI is a very good instrument. But there are studies using the BFI with 10 items instead of 44, and I'm less pleased with those.
Back there.
I wonder if you could say a little bit more about the twin data. We know that the MZ and the DZ twins, whether reared together or apart, are more alike. Concordance levels are stronger for them than for the dizygotic twins. But then you said that those data, those correlations are also stronger than family figures. Did I hear you correctly?
There are ways to estimate heritability from any degree of relationship. So fathers and children, or uncles and nieces and grandparents and grandchildren. But the genetic links are very small. They're diluted by these kinds of things. And as an empirical fact, studies that have looked at those kinds of family relationships instead of twin relationships have found consistently lower values for heritability. I think that there's a Psych Bulletin review that comes up with something like 0.47 for twins and 0.24 for family. That's a big difference.
So if I remember correctly, you said that it was still unclear about how to account for this difference.
It's certainly unclear to me.
But you just said a moment ago that there's the effects are diluted. That is to say, the subjects are more different in age, for one thing. Does that begin to account for the difference?
Yes, that could begin to account for the difference. What I intended to say was that the genetic similarity of MZ twins is 1.0 and of DZ twins is 0.5, or siblings. Between grandparents and grandchildren, it's what, 0.125? So that a little bit of noise can easily deflect the signal that you're getting there, the genetic signal. Now, you're saying there are other issues about differences in age, and that's certainly one of the possibilities. Usually, family studies will make the token adjustments for sex and age statistically, but that doesn't necessarily take into account the actual mechanical mechanisms that are going on. There are also issues that are underappreciated by most behavior geneticists having to do with method variance, and the possibility that method variance is itself heritable, so that MZ twins may describe themselves more alike because both of them have the same biases. So they're going to exaggerate. So my guess is that the true value is not 0.47 or 0.24, but somewhere in between. But that remains something that needs to be much more extensively investigated. Candler and his group in Germany are working on that.
So you talk about environment does not influence the trait, and then you talk about the traits actually changes across over time, like changes with ages. So I wonder, how would you conceptualize the influences of age and time on traits? Is it biology or yeah?
Yes, I would say that at least the major effect of age on traits is what I would call intrinsic maturation. So that, which we see in children all the time. You look at intelligence, and intelligence increases as you go from a 5-year-old to a 12-year-old, simply because their brains are developing. You don't need to explain them by saying, well, they're being educated. That may be part of it and may be a necessary component. but they basically will probably get to be more intelligent in any case, regardless of their circumstances. And I think the same thing goes with personality. Over a long period of, well, the biggest effect in personality development is between adolescence and early adulthood, the increase in conscientiousness. Teenagers are not a conscientious group. By the time you get to be 30, you are. And that's true all around the world. And there is a theory called social investment, which says, well, you have to become more conscientious because you have responsibilities as an adult, and you will develop the traits that are necessary for that. And that's a plausible alternative hypothesis. The trouble is there are a lot of studies that don't support it. One of its predictions, for example, is that people who have a first child will, in the subsequent years, become more conscientious than those who never have children or don't have them at this point in their life. And yet, large-scale studies that followed comparable groups of people who were and were not having first children didn't find that predictive increase in conscientiousness associated with parenthood. Other studies, especially work-related studies, do tend to find some effects. So we haven't sorted that out yet. I think there is almost surely a component of intrinsic maturation. Your brain is developing, or as you get old, your brain is atrophying, and those affect personality traits to some extent. There may, in addition to that, be environmental or cultural effects that are superimposed on that. But the data are not compelling at this point.
Okay, if there are no more questions, I have a small gift for Dr. McCrae for sharing his research insight with us. Please join me in thanking him again. And I remind you to join us upstairs for the reception. So, thank you very much for coming.
Okay.
You want the reception?